So thanks for coming, everybody. Hopefully you can see the slides okay. We are talking about interdiction today, aka bubbles. We'll cover what they are, where you find them, how the various types, what kind of ships are associated, and hopefully a little bit of useful advice on how not to get caught. I'm Yuri Levnick. I'm your instructor today. I have been bubbled many times, and I have bubbled a few people. So I have some bubble experience, but I'm by no means the senior expert in EVE. However, I'll do my best to steer you right and answer any questions. Speaking of which, everybody's doing a good job of not keying up. I appreciate that. But feel free to ask questions. I'm going to monitor class questions. And you're welcome for this class to ask questions via voice as well. So, questions are welcome at any point during the class. Please do not be offended if I kick your question to the end of the class if it's something that I want to cover in more detail. And we always recommend that you stay docked up in a station or citadel or logged out of the game while you're in class. But if you're high-sec mining, you should be fine. Just don't get blown up because you're paying attention to my fantastic class and you lose track of your ship. Okay? So what are we covering today? First, we're actually going to cover warp mechanics. It's really important to understand how warping works in order to have a good grasp on what bubbles do. And then we will, surprisingly, talk a lot about bubbles. And then we'll have a couple slides about getting away from bubbles or avoiding them in the first place. And we will end the class with a Q&A. Alright, warp mechanics. So, some of you probably already know this, but it's, as with anything in EVE, it's extremely complicated. So, warping, we say, is the primary method of faster-than-light travel in New Eden. The other noteworthy methods are jump drive jumping, and also, I guess, let's see. Yeah, that's the usuals. Filaments, I guess, count as well. Now, in order to warp, you have to be at least 150 kilometers from your destination. Well, this will come back later as a point. You can warp less than 150 kilometers, but wherever you're warping to has to be at least 150 kilometers away. And warping only works within the same system. So you enter warp and exit warp within the same system. Now here's the big one for us today. You have to align to your destination. So your ship has to turn from wherever it's facing and face the destination that you're going to. And you also have to reach a minimum speed, which is 75% of your current maximum speed. So in order to warp to a destination, you have to hit those two requirements. You can't be targeted while you're in warp. You can still be hit by things like smart bombs, especially because there's a slight delay to movement after dropping out of warp. So when you land on a gate with a smart bombing praxis, you still get blown up. I have experienced this many times myself, and I imagine some of you have as well. But yeah, there's a slight movement delay after dropping out of warp. Alright, more to the point for interdiction, we want to talk about warp strength. So most ships have a base warp strength of 0, like it says here, and all you need is 0 or better to enter warp. Ventures, supercarriers, and Titans have a base warp strength greater than 0. So I think 15 for supercarriers and Titans, and is it 2 for Ventures? It's either 1 or 2, I can't remember. But they have a base warp strength. And warp core stabilizers will also increase your warp strength by 1 or 2. So we talk a lot about points and scrams. Warp disruption, also known as a point, reduces your warp strength by 1. And typically, you warp disrupt somebody with, get this, a warp disruptor module. Warp scrambling reduces warp strength by 2 or 3, depending on how much ISK you spend on your scram. A better scram will cause more warp disruption. or warp scram, excuse me. And it also disables and prevents activation of micro warp and micro jump drives. The main drawback of a scram is that it's shorter range than a point. But a lot of, like, our scout ships will usually equip a point and a scram. If we're brawling, we might just take a scram. If we're kiting, we'll have points. So that's where most tackling happens. But today we're talking about interdiction, also known as bubbles. So while a point reduces warp strength by 1 and a scram reduces it by 2 or 3, a bubble effectively reduces warp strength by infinity. When you're in a bubble, you cannot warp. No matter if you've got warp core stabilizers, it doesn't matter if you're in a Titan. You cannot initiate warp when you're inside of a bubble. The exception here is that if you've got an interdiction nullifier, which a variety of ships can fit, that gives you immunity to bubbles, but not to a point or scram. So you can still be tackled with a nullifier running, but you cannot be bubbled with a nullifier running. How are we doing so far? Questions welcome anytime.
Ain't shuttles immune to bubbles as well?
They are, actually. That's a good point. Thank you. I should add that to the slide.
And don't deep space transports have a bonus to warp stab strength?
I actually don't know that offhand. I'm not a hauler of any variety. I thought they were unstabbed, but I could be completely wrong about that. Let's circle back at the end of the class, and we'll check if DSTs have a base warp strength for the hull of greater than 0. And then I may have to fix my slides. Thanks, Lee. Alright, the good stuff. Bubbles. So like we were just saying, it creates an infinitely strong warp disruption effect inside the bubble. The bubble is a sphere in space that you can actually see. So regardless of the way that it's been launched, there's a graphical effect that even shows up on potato mode. That's what we call the lowest graphics settings, affectionately, is potato mode. And you're able to see that sphere in space of warp disruption. If you're inside the bubble, like it says here, you can't warp until the bubble drops or until you exit the bubble. However, you're not scrammed. So within a bubble, you can use a micro warp drive or a micro jump drive. You just can't warp. Bubbles are only deployable in nullsec, Pochven, and wormholes. And like I was mentioning earlier, there's really only one nuance to this, which is that you can't use anchored bubbles in Thera. But aside from that, anywhere in nullsec, Pochven, or wormholes, be on the lookout for bubbles. And in Thera, people can still deploy heavy interdictor or interdictor bubbles. So there's still bubbles there. You just can't use an anchor bubble, and we'll cover the difference in a couple here. If a bubble is within 500 kilometers of the destination to which you are warping, you can be caught by the bubble. And generally, as you see here, we refer to bubbles a little more specifically as either catch / shield / wall bubbles, typically catch, which are bubbles that get you before you get to your destination. And then there are bubbles that catch you after you try to get to your destination. So those are called drag bubbles. And you will actually land further than you intended to warp from where you started. And then we'll talk in a minute here. Arguably, putting a bubble directly on your destination makes it a catch bubble, but that's almost its own classification of bubble, as a bubble that is right on top of where you're warping to. Neither in front of nor behind. A little bit of an Eve nuance here. This is one that we saw yesterday for those who are on fleet with me. Bubbles are calculated, or the bubble mechanics are calculated when you enter warp. So at the instant that the Eve client, if you've got sound on, tells you warp drive engaged, hashtag Star Trek, that is when bubble mechanics are calculated. What does that mean? It means that if you enter warp and a bubble goes up on your destination or in your warp path after you've entered warp, you will go straight through the bubble or not be dragged by it if it's a drag bubble. So that bubble will not have any effect on you. Conversely, if the bubble is up when you warp and it drops while you're in warp, you will still be caught by it. So you will land at a weird place and there'll be generally no bubble there because the bubble has come down. But you'll have landed, either before, after, not on your actual destination, despite the fact that the bubble is now gone. Yesterday, we warped, and they threw a bubble after we were in warp, and we all landed on the gate and laughed at them, and jumped the gate, and carried on our merry way, because their bubble had gone up too late. Graphics time! So this is a pretty good representation of how bubbles work. I probably would have done this in reverse, but in this case you're starting from the right, and the arrows indicate the direction of your warp. So you're starting from the right side of the picture and warping to the left. And you can see here we've got a catch bubble and a drag bubble labeled. And then you've got either a gate or a destination in the middle. So let's take the example of a gate. Let's say you're warping gate to gate. If somebody throws a catch bubble and you're going straight gate to gate, you will land in the catch bubble before you get to your gate. By contrast, if they've thrown a drag bubble, you will land in the drag bubble after the gate. Now, if they have both, which is unusual but possible, you'll land in the catch bubble. So you'll land in the first one you calculate in your path. Now we're going to talk a lot about angles here, and there's a lot of trigonometry involved. My apologies. Or maybe just straight up geometry. We could debate that. But in any case, as with many things in Eve, there's math. And the particular math that we care about here is the angle that the bubble will catch you in. So if you're going gate to gate and there's a bubble, you will be caught. But what if you're going from a planet to the gate and there's a bubble between the gates? Well, in that case, the game is going to calculate a line between you and your destination, and it's going to see if that line intersects any bubbles and if said bubbles are within 500 kilometers of your destination. So if the line between you and your destination hits a bubble and that bubble is within 500 km of where you're going, you will be caught. So we see at the bottom of the slide here, the closer the bubble is to the gate, the wider the angle that it will catch people. And if you think about it a little bit, if you put a bubble directly on the gate, it will catch people in 360 degrees. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute here. But you can put a bubble directly on the gate and it will catch people coming from any direction. But they'll be relatively close to the gate, so they can actually probably burn through your bubble and jump the gate and get away. By contrast, if you put the bubble further away from the gate, then people will land far away from the gate and you can tackle them and they are less likely to be able to get to the gate, but your angle for which you will capture them is progressively smaller the further the bubble away from the gate, and the smaller the bubble. So yeah, math. How about that? How are we doing so far?
So far, so good.
Yeah, so I see a question regarding, well, first of all, I see a clarification. Thank you. A deep space transport does have +2 warp strength. I'm an old man, and I used to play the game back when all interceptors were nullified and things like that, so I know old stuff, but that's the way it is these days with the kids and what have you. With a catch bubble or drag bubble, so that's a good question. I don't have this anywhere in the slides, but actually I've heard and read that the mass of your ship is what determines how far you land in the bubble. So if you're in like a frigate, you will land at the edge of the bubble, the near edge of the bubble, I should say, in either a catch or a drag bubble. So in this chart, you would land on the rightmost edge of either of those two bubbles. Whereas if you're in like a battleship, you will land further into the bubble, the mass of your ship actually. And this has been a topic of debate. I actually went back and read the in-game rules, and they do support that. And I've seen that in practice as well, that the bigger the ship you're in, the further you land in the bubble.
Thank you for explaining. I did not know that.
Yeah, interesting, right?
So the distinction then between a catch bubble and a drag bubble is that a catch bubble interrupts your warp before you reach your destination, so it's in front of the destination. And a drag bubble is past where you were trying to warp to, and so it drags you further than you intended to warp. Is that right?
That is exactly right. Perfect. You're paying attention. You get 5 bonus points. There'll be a test later. The test will involve us all blowing up in bubbles. All right, so we've covered this to some extent, but I'm going to get into a little more detail here. Bubbling on a gate or a wormhole, very common. Great way to camp. Bad way to get caught. And all you got to do is park your interdictor or heavy interdiction cruiser on the gate or on the wormhole. And when you see the gate activate, that is when you see somebody come through. In Potchven, you won't see them pop into local. In Nullsec, you'll see them pop into local. In Wormhole Space, you won't see them pop into local, but you can watch the gate or the wormhole activate, and you can actually tell whether it's inbound to you or outbound from you. So as soon as you see somebody come in, you bubble them, right? Interdictor drops a probe, heavy interdiction cruiser fires up its bubble, and then if whoever it is unfortunate enough to spawn in the bubble, I'm sorry, I see a question here. That graphic is not 500 kilometers in diameter. No, it's a variable size of graphic, but the maximum size of the graphic would be 500 kilometers. And another question here: if you're jumping into a cosmic sig, like the green signatures, and you land in a bubble, do you land in the edge or near the middle? And again, that's going to be based on the mass of your ship. So if you're in a frigate, you'll land near the edge. If you're in a battleship, you'll land closer to the middle. Thanks for the questions. I appreciate it. It means y'all are paying attention, which warms my cold little pirate heart. So yeah, if somebody spawns inside of your bubble when they've jumped through the gate or the wormhole, they can't warp out. They are caught. And then generally, if you're camping, you're going to want to tackle them with something else. Interceptor, Kiris, Arazu, whatever it happens to be, something that's got good tackle, so that when they try to burn out of your bubble or burn back to the gate, they can't, and you can blow them up. Alright, difficult concept here. Not terribly difficult, but a little difficult. Gates are not all the same size. So a gate between two random systems is smaller than a gate between two constellations, which is a red line on Dotlan, and a regional gate, which is like between two totally different maps on Dotlan, is even bigger, physically larger in space. You know, if you were to imagine the gate as a sphere, which it's not, but it operates a lot like a sphere in space in terms of bumping it, the sphere is bigger for a constellation gate and bigger for a regional gate, even still. And in Potchman, all the gates are pretty big. Some of them are big, some of them are real big. So when you're trying to set up a bubble trap like this with an interdictor or heavy interdiction cruiser, it's harder to do on a larger gate because they are mathematically more likely to spawn somewhere outside of your bubble. So with a little gate, when you drop a bubble on it, you can often get 360 degrees around the whole gate. But with the big gate, when you drop a bubble on it, you're only able to cover part of that sphere because you aren't able to actually fly into the gate. It's a physical object that cannot be flown into by any kind of ship. So you have to bubble on the edge of it where you can actually sit, and that means you are not able to cover the whole gate. This gets us all the time in Potchman. So we'll try to, somebody will jump through behind us. We've got a bubble, Lee throws a bubble for me, and the gate's huge, so we only end up bubbling like a third of it, and they just happen to get lucky and spawn outside of that third of the gate we bubbled. So they can warp off. It's very sad. Yeah, like we talked about. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, can you then put just multiple bubbles around if you have multiple interdictors?
That's a very good question, and the answer is absolutely. So if you were to say, stick one interdictor between the gates and then another two kind of behind, you can cover most of a Potchman gate with bubbles. So that's definitely possible. The other thing you can do if you're really quick is you can have your interdictor fly around, and you can drop up to 3 bubbles out of an interdictor, and we'll talk about that in a second here. So you can have one interdictor drop multiple bubbles in different locations. But if the person who you're bubbling spawns outside of the bubble and immediately warps, that doesn't work. We talked a little bit about catch and drag bubbles. Some more nuances here. Typically, if you want to do a catch or a drag bubble that's not directly, like a catch bubble that's not directly on the gate, that's between gates, or a drag bubble, you want to be within 150 kilometers of the place the person is likely to be warping to. The gate, the wormhole, the station, the SIG, whatever. Now, the reason you want to do this is because when they land in a bubble, particularly a drag bubble, they will be too close to warp to their final destination. So they'll land and they'll want to warp down, fly out of your bubble first and then warp down to the destination, but they won't be able to because they're too close. So that gives you more time to tackle them and blow them up. Now with the catch bubble, they're going to land on the side of the bubble closer to where they came from. So their best bet is to turn around and warp back to where they came from, rather than flying all the way through the bubble and then flying all the way to their original destination because they're too close to warp. For drag bubbles, it's also generally going to be easiest for them to warp back to their destination, but they may also decide just to turn around and burn into their original destination. But probably they're going to try to warp back to their point of origin. So, how are we doing? Doing good? Thank you, by the way, Zipkin, for putting in some useful information down here in the chat. I'll read it out for the crew here. The only way to get someone to land closer to the middle of a bubble is to use the double bubble trick, which I've never done. You place a small bubble at 499 kilometers to drag the enemy in, and then a large bubble at 504 kilometers away. You don't get sucked into the large bubble as it's outside of 500 km. So that bubble is, when it calculates your warp route, that bubble is not included. EVE says, nope, 504 kilometers. It has to be within 500 of where you're landing, so you don't get caught by that bubble. But the small bubble is 499, so you get sucked into the small bubble, and then you're sitting within the large bubble because the large bubble has the small bubble within it. So that's a way to get somebody to land deep within a bubble. And this would be something you do with anchor bubbles, which we'll talk about what that is in a minute. So I promise we'll get there. Hold any questions on that particular topic for just a moment. Let's talk about sources of bubbles. I've mentioned both of these. Interdictors are what we'll see most frequently. They are Tech 2 destroyers. They're relatively inexpensive, somewhere 80 to 120 mil for a T2 fit in that general neighborhood, depending on which one you use and how you fit it. And they use a module called an Interdiction Sphere Launcher, which launches a warp disrupt probe or a surgical warp disrupt probe or a webifying probe, a wobble. But we won't talk about wobbles today. That's for Clarity's tackle track. He can deal with that. We care about warp disruption bubbles today. A warp disruption probe, when the interdictor launches it, it launches at that point where the interdictor is, and it sits there. And then the interdictor can go fly around. So, if you're in the interdictor, you hit that probe launcher, you launch the probe, and then generally you're going to want to fly out of the bubble because you don't really want to be in the bubble. Or, you can potentially jump the gate. You don't get a weapons timer. So if you're sitting on a gate, you can bubble the gate and you can jump it, and then you're out of harm's way. You can bubble the person if they go back through the gate. But the important thing here is that you're just dropping a bubble in space. You cannot target warp disrupt probes. So there's no way to target and shoot them to destroy them. But they can both be booshed or they can be smart bombed. So there's some very interesting strategies around dropping a bubble and then using a boosher to micro jump drive field the bubble 100 km in whatever direction and land it on people. That's pretty cool if you can pull it off. And if you have smart bombs, you can use them to pop bubbles, interdiction bubbles by way of warp disrupt probes. Surgical warp disrupt probe has a tiny radius. Normal warp disrupt probe has a larger radius. And there's a lot of theory behind why we'd use one or the other. The only time I ever see surgical warp disrupt probes are there's some guys that use them in Pochven on their mining sites to, and in this case they put them directly on the warp in for the anomaly in order to catch anybody who warps in to kill the miners. So that all those people land in this little tiny sphere right on top of the warp in, rather than on varying places on the edge or in the middle of the larger sphere. But typically people use standard warp disrupt probes. How about Hicks? Heavy interdiction cruisers. Hicks is a questionable acronym, but that's what we use. So I'm like, alright, that's Hicks. They use a high slot module called a warp disruption field generator, and that creates a bubble around the cruiser. So these are Tech 2 cruisers, pricing somewhere north of 200 million, so a fair bit more than an interdictor. And when you use a Hick, you are the bubble. The radius is 16 kilometers to 25 kilometers, depending on pilot skills and whether you're using Tech 1 or Tech 2 or faction. And it cycles for 30 seconds. So when you turn that bubble on, you are the bubble for 30 seconds. It is centered on you. You can move. So as you move around, the bubble moves with you, which is different from an interdictor. An interdictor drops a probe in space and then moves independently, and the probe stays where it was. A Hick, as it moves, the bubble moves with it, because the bubble is centered on the Hick. And when you've got your bubble up, you can't receive remote reps or assistance. I think it's like 99% reduction in effectiveness or something like that, so technically you kind of can, I think, but it doesn't really work. And your sig radius is balloons, so you become bigger in space and easier to hit. So, as with all things Eve, they couldn't just make it simple. There are more nuances to a warp disruption field generator. In particular, you can script them for what we call an infinity point. And you can either use an infinity point or an infinity scram. Those are both scripts you can load into the module. Now, what does that mean? Well, an infinity point is a longer range warp disruption effect targeted. So you have to target something and then turn it on, but it is infinitely strong. So this is what we use for tackling supercarriers and titans, and if you really hate ventures in low sec. I guess you could potentially use it in high sec too for ventures, but don't do that. Please don't take a Hick into high sec and suicide tackle adventure. Maybe if you're war deck or something, I don't know. Anyway, more importantly, this is really useful for tackling supercarriers and titans because they have inherent warp core strength, but this is an infinitely strong point. And then the difference here between an infinity point and an infinity scram is a point has got longer range, but a scram also turns off micro warp and micro jump drives. So you're more likely to see infinity points because supercarriers and titans are extremely slow to start out with. So having an infinity scram is not particularly important, but technically it's on the books. It does exist. And in both cases, either if you use unscripted with the bubble or scripted with point/scram, you start and maintain a weapons timer. So tactically, there's a big difference here. Like, for example, an interdictor can drop a bubble and then jump a gate and drop a bubble on the other side. Whereas with a hick, you can't do that. Once you've got the bubble up, you have a weapons timer and you're not able to jump the gate. So, it's how you use these, and we won't get into this in too much detail today, but this is the point of the Interdiction study group. Shameless plug. Come join us and learn about interdiction. Now, the uses are tactically different beyond just one being more expensive than the other. This is important stuff. How we doing? Clear as mud?
Seems pretty clear so far.
Alright, 2 more sources of bubbles. An excellent question. Do hicks essentially prevent your fleet mates from bouncing if they are primaried? So all 4 types of bubbles here are, they don't care about whether or not somebody is in your fleet. If you drop an interdiction, like a warp disrupt probe, or if you spin up your hick bubble and your buddies are inside of that bubble, they can't warp either. So tactically, you want to be prepared. This one of my favorite moments to see in EVE is when somebody is sitting on the gate with an interdictor and they bubble the gate when somebody comes through, not knowing what has come through, and it's something like a Tengu or something vastly more powerful than an interdictor. And you say, "Oh, I'm stuck, I can't get out." And then you get blown up unless you're able to jump the gate, or if you're in a hick, you just get blown up. So yeah, you can definitely trap all your buddies and have a much larger fleet come through and kill you all. And none of them will be able to get away because you've thrown a bubble on your own fleet. I have done that. Just one of those things. And that's not specific to hick bubbles. Any kind of bubble can trap your own fleet, but it's far more likely to happen with a hick or with an interdictor. Speaking of which, so this mobile warp disruptor, we talked a little bit about anchor bubbles a minute ago. It's a deployable structure that creates a bubble. Any ship can deploy an anchored bubble. You need like anchoring 1 to deploy the most basic of them, although you need more advanced anchoring skills to deploy fancier bubbles. But yeah, any kind of ship can drop one. The diameter varies from 5 km to 40 km depending on the size of the bubble and its tech level. So they come in small, medium, large, T1 and T2. And they have a deployment time, anywhere from 1 minute for T2 small to 8 minutes for T1 large. So tactically that's very important. There is no deployment time for a heavy interdiction cruiser or a warp disrupt probe. You can spin that bubble up instantly. Whereas with an anchored bubble, you need to plan ahead and have enough time to actually anchor it before whoever is coming through gets to you. So tactically, the uses are pretty different. You can target and destroy an anchored bubble, although large bubbles have a lot of health. Very time consuming to blow up a large, especially a T2 large bubble. Takes a while to blow one of those up. Very boring. And also very important here, as with any deployable, there's at least some minimum distance that you have to be from another anchored structure in space in order to deploy them. So very importantly here, you can't drop a large anchored bubble directly on top of a gate.
When you drop the disruptor, does that automatically deploy it?
So there's a different button for deploy from JetCam. So you can JetCam a mobile warp disruptor, jettison it, and it will not deploy, as opposed to actually going through the deployment mechanic and deploying it. Is that what you were asking? I'm sorry, maybe I'm answering the wrong question.
I just wondered if when you normally deploy one, does that cause it to then create the bubble, or do you have to take a separate step once it's in space to make it make a bubble?
Ah, a good question. Yeah, so once it's deployed, the bubble comes up automatically, and regardless of whether or not you want it to. So again, you can trap yourself in your own bubble, intentionally or unintentionally. So let's talk a little bit about a kind of bubble that I've only seen, I think once, maybe twice, but probably only once. Supercarrier bubbles. So a supercarrier is able to mount a warp disruption burst projector that shoots a bubble up to 500 kilometers through space. So they can throw this bubble at a remote location. It's a bubble that's 10 kilometers in diameter, lasts for 40 seconds, and is on an 8-minute cooldown. So from like a gate camping perspective, it's not very useful because it's on that 8-minute cooldown. And in practice, I don't know that these have a whole lot of tactical uses aside from being fun. But they are pretty cool, I guess, if you're flying your supercarrier without support from interdictors and Hicks. And you really should have support from interdictors and Hicks if you're flying a supercarrier. So that's my political statement for the day. If you're going to fly a supercarrier, you should have an interdictor alt. Yeah, I'll say it now. Yeah, like I said, I've only seen in Delve. I did get a supercarrier launched a bubble at me one time. I didn't get caught in it, but it did launch it at me, and I was like, "Whoa!" I had no idea they could do that. It was quite something. All right, so let's talk a little bit. We've been talking about catching people with bubbles. Let's talk about not getting caught in bubbles for a minute here. So, bullet number one, the easiest thing, if you've got it, is to warp to a tactical. Like in the PC9 pocket, we've got gate tacs. In Pochfin, there's a bookmarks folder that has gate tacs. So if you hit one of those tacticals, particularly an above or below tactical, you're almost always going to be out of line with any bubbles on that gate. Now, in Pochfin, we've got above and below tacticals. We also have in front and behind tacticals. If you have a bubble, like a catch bubble, and you try to go to the behind tactical, you're going to hit the catch bubble. And unless it's not within 500 kilometers of your destination. But you're probably going to hit the catch bubble. And similarly, if you use the before tactical. So when you think about which tactical to use, above or below are safe bets most of the time. Right and left, also pretty good bets. In front or behind, not a good bet. Not a good way to avoid a bubble. And you can kind of see that in our little diagram here. So the bottom left diagram has got two gates. Just as examples, this could be any two destinations, but two gates is the most common thing we can talk about. And you can see the X on the first diagram is a tactical, in this case, a left tactical, I would say. Space left. And there's not really left in space, but humor me. It's a left tactical. So if you warp to that tack, you're not in line with the gate, and that means that you will miss most, if not all, bubbles. So there's geometry involved. That's why I have to say most, but not all. If your tactical is 25 kilometers off the gate, which is a worthless tactical, and you should never put one there, then you might still land in a large bubble that's right in front of the gate. Whereas if it's 500 kilometers off the gate, the odds of you landing in a bubble are practically zero, because again, you have to be within 500 km of the bubble in order for it to trigger, and you also have to be in line with the bubble. So 500, 550, 600 km is almost always safe. And then in between gets a little complicated. But if the gates are far apart, and in most cases they are, you're probably okay. But don't come crying to me if you warp to your attack and the gates are only 3 AU apart because it's Pachman and somebody's got a huge bubble anchored out, like a large bubble anchored out front of it, and you get caught. That's an unfortunate situation, but it can happen. So what if you don't have attack? Common situation for most space. The first option generally is going to be to warp to a safe that is not directly between the origin and destination. So in the bottom right here, we've got a little chart about how to create an out-of-line safe between 2 points. So C1 and C2, those are 2 celestials, not gates. Maybe C1 is a gate, but C2 should not be a gate. It should be some random planet somewhere. You warp there, and you create bookmark 1 as you're in warp. Bookmark 1 is what we call a mid-safe. I'm going to call it a mid-safe because it's the midpoint between 2 physical objects that you can warp to. Given a lot of time and patience, people can actually warp in on your mid-safe without combat probes, so it's not as good as a true safe, which is what you get when you go to your safe. So you warp to bookmark 1, and then you warp to a third place, so neither the gate you came from nor the planet you used to make your mid-safe. You warp to a third planet, typically, and you drop a safe while you're in warp between your bookmark, your mid-safe bookmark, and the third celestial. That safe is almost impossible to warp in on. Nobody really has the time to warp in on that, so you just have to watch out for combat probes. So once you've got that safe, as long as it's out of line with the gates, if you warp from the safe to, in this case, the gate, you can see on our little bottom left chart, you've got a warping from another celestial or a safe. Either of the two will likely put you on an angle that is not in the bubble. Now this can go wrong. So it says here, don't use the sun, and that's because sometimes people will put a second bubble between the gate and the sun. That's pretty unusual, but it does happen. And also, people sometimes camp the sun, so don't use the sun. But also, if your in gate is right next to a planet and you warp to that planet and then you warp to the out gate, well, you haven't really done yourself any good, because you're warping from a place, an origin spot, that's at roughly the same angle to the out gate as the original gate that you were on. So you want to warp to a planet that is way out of line with the line between the 2 gates. Clear as mud? Alright, we'll keep going. It's geometry. I'm not going to apologize for it because that's how it is, but there is geometry. So, the other option here, and this is one that I use frequently, is to warp to a destination within D-scan range of my goal, my objective, in this case the out gate, and then just scan to see if there's any bubbles there. So, a planet that's nearby, a station, whatever it happens to be. Most systems have got celestials or stations, or even player-owned stations close to the gate that you can use as a warp in and then descan for bubbles. And if there's no bubbles, you don't have to worry about it, obviously. You just warp straight down. If there are bubbles, you got to think about, how am I going to get out of line of this bubble, or do I need to come back a different day, or whatever, right? You need to actually use some evasive maneuvers. But this is a way to get more intel. So, have all types of bubbles in your directional scanner. It's important. So you'll want to have warp disrupt probes, anchored bubbles, and you unfortunately have to memorize the 4 types of Higgs, which I believe is a homework assignment for you to go and read about those on the wiki. but you'll need to memorize the 4 types of hicks and see if they are on the out gate. If you don't want to do that, then don't cry to me when you get blown up. But there are alternatives. One common thing to do is check and see if there's been any kills in system using a couple third-party websites. So .lan will show you the size of the gates, and also it will show you whether or not there have been player kills, but the data is delayed. Same is true for Eve Gate Camp Check. That will tell you specifically whether or not there have been kills on gates in a system between your origin and destination. So you punch in JITA to PC9 and it will check the entire route and tell you that people are getting killed in 6 taxi or Reb or whatever. But again, data is delayed. So your best bet for up-to-date data is zKillboard. And like if you're going through Amazon, would be a prime example. Amazon is the only low-sec system on the short route between JITA and Amar. And I will often check zKillboard there and see if anybody is getting blown up in Amazon by Smart Bombing Praxi or Gate Camps or whatever. But you can use it on null too. Now there's a catch here. Get ready. Got some theory for you. Bubbling somebody does not get you on the kill mail. Bubbling somebody and then they try to warp out of your bubble and fail to warp gets you on the kill mail. So you may see a kill mail in a null-sec system, say SIG-TAC-C or something like that, that has 8 caracals on it on a gate, but no interdictors. And all that means is that whatever hapless person came through and got bubbled didn't try to warp out of the bubble. They tried to burn back to the gate, or they tried to burn out of the bubble, or they did something besides hit that warp button. So that interdictor did not get on that kill mail. So that's an important thing to consider when you're checking zKillboard or any of these other sources actually for whether or not there's bubbles, is the bubbler may be able to avoid appearing on the kill mail. Okay, so what happens if you spawn inside a bubble when you jump a gate or a wormhole? Happens. It's bad. You got 60 seconds of gate or jump cloak. So generally you're going to want to think about it for a moment. Easy one is if you've got an interdiction nullifier, then just use your interdiction nullifier and warp out. You can activate the module while you're still cloaked. As long as your align time is not too bad, you can usually get out okay. So scepters, yes. Larger stuff with an interdiction nullifier, you might still get caught by a point or a scram, even though you've got a nullifier. But generally, that's going to be your best bet to get out. If you got a cloak, align to, generally you don't want to go to the next gate because there's people camping the system, so you want to align to a safe, celestial, somewhere else where there's unlikely to be bubbles and tackle and bad things. And then as soon as you hit a line, best thing to do is to hit your micro warp drive and then immediately hit your cloak. You got to be fast. And what that's going to do is it's going to give you a full cycle of your micro warp drive, which is what you should have equipped. We could debate that extensively. But in this case, we want to have a micro warp drive, and then you cloak up and you still get that micro warp drive bonus, so you drift out of the bubble, even if it's a relatively large bubble. And then if you've got a ship that can warp cloaked, like a bomber, then you warp off, or you decloak and warp off, and just hope you don't get tackled. But if you're not in any of those lucky situations, and you just have a normal ship, usually your best bet is actually going to be to burn back to whence you came, and jump back through the wormhole or the gate. So even if they point you, scram you, whatever, you're still allowed to go back through the gate. And that's generally the best way to get out of a bubble camp if you don't have a nullifier, and often if you don't have a cloak. The catch here is, like we said earlier, an interdictor can bubble you on one side, jump the gate, reapproach on the other side, and bubble the other side, and so you get caught on both sides, which is bad. So Anyway, and if that happens, there's not a whole lot to do. You're probably out of luck. You can keep
What?
bouncing back and forth, but yeah. Go ahead.
If you aren't close enough to the bubble edge that you can actually use the cloak, does the cloak then fail once you get within the 200 clicks or of the 2 clicks of the gate of the bubble edge?
Yeah. So that's actually a great question with a somewhat longer answer. Briefly, actually, I think Minda, I think you're right. I think I've got this backwards here. Align cloak micro warp drive. Because I've failed on that one. So excuse me, Minda is saying for the cloak trick, it's better to align cloak micro warp drive in terms of the order in which you hit the buttons. I need to fix that on this slide. Thank you.
I'm not sure because some ships can't micro warp drive with the cloak on, right?
Yeah, you
Go ahead.
you want to align, then cloak, then micro warp drive. You can activate a micro warp drive within the first few seconds of cloak being up.
Oh, right, because it's still establishing.
And so a bubble does not interfere with your ability to cloak, so it doesn't count as an object for decloaking. And you can actually warp into a bubble and be caught by it or dragged by it with your cloak up, and the people who are in the bubble won't know that you're there because you'll still be cloaked. So you don't need to worry about the bubble taking down your cloak. However, if the people who are hunting you are good and they know what they're doing, they'll typically have either an interceptor or a fast boat with drones on the gate, and as soon as you appear, they will hit approach, micro warp drive on, launch drones if they have them. When you cloak, their ship will attempt to stop, but if you hit the max speed, it will continue to go in a straight line in the same direction it was headed, meaning directly at you. So they will carry on in a straight line directly to the point at which you cloaked. And if they got drones out, that expands their decloaking radius. So that's how you, especially with a slow ship or a ship that didn't micro warp drive, your odds of getting decloaked by somebody who knows what they're doing are pretty high. And that's not the bubble that does it. It's the secondary tackle that will decloak you.
Is it also correct that whatever generated the bubble, whether it's a probe or an anchored disruptor or the ship itself, that of course is collidable and can decloak you, although that's usually not relevant here?
That's entirely true, yeah. So if you run into the interdictor or you run into the heavy interdiction cruiser or the anchored bubble, those will all decloak you. And in practice, what you'll see sometimes is like if they've got a drag bubble set up, or if you've got a drag bubble set up, you'll see spaces just littered with corpses and jet cans and stuff. And there usually will be a ship with drones out sitting on the edge of the bubble, like if we're saying a drag bubble. And I'm going to go back up here a little bit. Give me a moment. Don't get motion sick. So if we're looking at our drag bubble here, on the rightmost side of the drag bubble, they'll usually put a ship there with drones out. So if anybody warps in cloaked and lands on the rightmost edge of the drag bubble, like in a stealth bomber, they'll automatically be decloaked by the ship that's there with the drones, even though the bubble doesn't decloak them. And then you litter your bubble with jet cans and corpses and wrecks and other stuff, so that people who are trying to cloak up and get out of the bubble are more likely to run into something and get decloaked. So if you see a bubble that's an absolute mess, that's actually somebody making a strategic decision to prevent cloaking, rather than just them being messy. Yeah, so if you're caught in system and decloaked landing on a bubble, speaking of which, best option is usually to burn back whence you came and warp back. Sometimes you can burn through, especially if there's nobody there. Sometimes you can shoot the bubble, like an anchored bubble if it's unattended. But usually your best bet is to just turn around 180, go back from where you came from. Yeah, and you probably are going to have to pulse your micro warp drive to get out of the bubble unless you're in something that's very light. So, that's what I wanted to cover today. I am spinning up a class, hopefully, maybe a practical, be more likely, for interdiction, more like 301, which will be about a lot of the things about, okay, well, like if you're in a fleet, where do you drop the bubble? And if you're in a kiting fleet, fighting a brawling fleet, where do you drop the bubble? And if you're setting up a camp, when do you throw the bubble up? And all these more advanced tactical considerations. But for today, we've covered the essentials. And with apology, well, I'm not going to apologize for the geometry, but there is a lot of geometry. So, questions, comments, concerns? And I'll go ahead and stop the recording here so that you can ask them without being recorded.